Hello! If you visited before, thanks for coming back. If you're new here, welcome. Check out my channel intro to get acquainted. This is the third video in my HACCP series. If you haven't seen the previous two videos, I suggest you watch them because they really build off of each other. You can find a link in the description for the whole HACCP playlist. My name's Pierre-Antoine and I'll be your guide on this HACCP journey. First, let's recall our HACCP principles. Hazard analysis, identification of critical control points, establishment of critical limits, monitoring procedures, corrective action, record keeping, and verification procedure. By now, you should have your hazard analysis and identification of critical control points done. Remember that we refer to critical control points as CCPs. Now, we're going to put all that hard work to use. For each critical point that you identified in the previous step, you're going to set at least one critical limit for it. After that, we're going to establish monitoring procedures to keep an eye on our critical limits. Critical limits are maximum or minimum values for a parameter at a critical control point whose purpose is to prevent, eliminate, or reduce the likelihood of a food safety hazard occurring. When you're working with critical limits, these parameters are called factors. A factor is just something that's been proven to minimize risk for different types of CCPs. The most common factors in the food industry are pH, temperature, time, often combined with temperature, water activity, and moisture. When you're setting a critical limit, what you do is you choose one of those factors, like temperature, and set a minimum or maximum value that this can be for a specific critical control point. A CCP can have more than one critical limit because sometimes multiple factors will work together to minimize the risk efficiently. It's important to know that any critical limit you set has to be proven scientifically to reduce risk to an acceptable level. So you can't do things like choose what feels right or what you think will work. Make sure you cite any tests or references to food science literature in your documentation. Also note that you can't use factors that would take too long to measure. That means as fun as it would be to run the test, you can't use something like quantity of microorganisms as a critical limit factor. Time and temperature are often used in conjunction for cooked products. For example, if you're making a cooked ground beef product, you can have critical limits that require your meat to be at 160 Fahrenheit for 5 seconds. Once you've established your critical limits, it's time to determine how you're going to monitor them and what instruments you're going to need to do that. Monitoring is important because it's how we assess if a critical control point is under control. There are two types of monitoring, continuous and periodic. Continuous monitoring can be done with a variety of tools. For example, an always-on X-ray machine installed on a production line can detect inconsistencies in the texture of your product and send an alert when the critical limit is reached. Periodic monitoring is usually done by hand. An employee will read the factor's value, record it, and compare it to the critical limit. Make sure to establish the frequency of periodic monitoring. It could be once an hour, once per production lot, or whatever frequency makes sense within your production process. In a restaurant, for example, you could take the temperature of a chicken breast, the thickest of the lot, for every batch that comes out of the oven. Training on CCP monitoring is very important because the staff in charge of it will need to know the critical limits, what instruments they need to do the monitoring, and how to use them. If all goes well, your monitoring should show that you're within critical limits, which will usually be the case most of the time. But what happens when something goes wrong? Stay tuned for my next video, which will cover corrective action. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.